Hello everyone, welcome back aboard the Night Train for another video, and this one is a very exciting one because finally we're getting our first pieces of scenery down on the railway boards behind me. The first scenic feature that I decided to tackle on the railway boards was the farmyard that I'm planning on having right in the back corner. There wasn't really much that I could do with the space that was available, so I thought a few farmyard buildings, tiny concrete yard, you can at least display some old steam traction vehicles or tractors or some other interesting bits for people to look at when they're scanning their eyes over the railway. So that's what I did. I broke out my scenery stuff, some of it I've had for absolute yonks just in storage, and actually cracked on with making a tiny diorama in the back corner of the railway. It took a long time even to do this one tiny corner, and I really filmed myself doing this for hours upon hours on end, and I've had to try and cut it down and edit it into something that is quick, easy, digestible and watchable for everyone. So this is only a part one of all my modelling on this farmyard, but we're going to cover static grass, textured paints, ballasting, lots of really important modelling techniques if you're building your own railways. So without further ado, let's see what I've been up to. First I put a layer of foam to raise the farmyard off the board a tad, and glued a layer of wet and dry emery paper over this to give the farmyard surface some texture. A layer of primer was then applied. Next I set to work on the rear embankment. Using slivers of a cardboard box, I cut some landformers and glued these along the back against a strip of balsa wood. These each had a slightly different slope to introduce some variety into the embankment's topography. I then put 2 layers of Modrock over all the board around the farmyard as an uneven base layer for the field and to form the surface of the embankment. The Modrock roll was cut into pieces of a usable size and dipped in water and then laid onto the board. Once the Modrock had dried and I was happy with the form of the land, I painted this with a base layer of brown acrylic paints. This will show up any gaps when I lay the static grass and give the impression of a layer of soil beneath if there are any tiny gaps in coverage that seep through. Next, a layer of watered down PVA glue at a 50-50 ratio with a dab of washing up liquid added in was pasted over the area where the static grass will be applied. I let the glue mixture sit for over 24 hours before applying to ensure that the glue had properly broken down in the water. The static grass applicator is filled up with some grass fibres, making sure any clumps are broken up. I've been given numerous tubs and sachets of static grass over the years, but I opted to use the smallest length fibres of my preferred shade to put down as a base layer. Placing the end of the wire onto the board, I then shook the applicator to scatter the grass over the glue. The current running through the mesh charges the grass fibres so that they settle standing up in the glue. in the main farmyard, I applied a layer of textured concrete paint over the emery paper, as the farmyard I'm modelling is going to have a concrete surface. I spread the textured paint as evenly as possible, making sure there were no lumps, and I gave it 2 coats to give it a nice even layering. With the base layer of static grass dried, I turned my attention to the track passing the farm. Using N-gauge ballast for a finer effect than 00 gauge ballast, I used a ballast spreader to apply the ballast over a small section of track. Using a brush, I brushed away any excess either further down the line to thin the ballast out and to cover a further area, or away from the track to be hoovered up so I could reuse it later. I left the outer side of the inner rail lightly touched at the moment so that I could fill this in later once I modelled the scenery on the inside of the loop. When ballasting track, make sure no grains of ballast sit on top of the sleepers or on top of the rails or inside the rails. Tapping the rails with the back of a spoon will help dislodge any bits of ballast that have ended up there. It also helps to test a piece of rolling stock over the track to test for any derailments. With the ballast in place, I sprayed it with some water mixed with a drop of washing up liquid and applied this through an atomizer to wet the ballast in order to break the surface tension. Then, using a pipette, I dribbled a stream of diluted PVA glue, the same dilution as I used for the static grass, along the outsides and between the rails, careful not to push up any of the ballast. Back on the farmyard, I painted a diluted brown acrylic paint over the concrete to simulate where vehicles will attract mud into the yard. I wiped up a lot of this using a paper towel to leave mud stains over the concrete, and I repeated this with diluted black acrylic paint as well, where vehicles may have sat or leaked oil onto the ground, as well as where tyre tracks might have run and converged. While my barn and open shed are recycled from previous layouts, I had yet to finish painting the garage buildings, having built them just enough so I could mark out their base footprint. Made from a Wills kit SS12 station garage kit, I cut out and cleaned up the roof and door pieces I needed using a craft knife and file. I then glued the roof sheets into place, making sure that they're aligned and squared. Once the building was given a coat of primer, I painted the roof with a Revel tank grey acrylic base layer, inside and out in case I wanted to fit interior detail at a later point. The walls were painted in Revel earth brown acrylic to give them a woody effect. In keeping with the style of the other farm buildings, some blue framework was added to give the building some exterior detail. The doors and window frames I painted in a Humbrol dark green as I'd done with the barn. One thing I tried was to have hinged doors on the garage. For this I cut out a small piece of card and scored it 5mm vertically. Once the score was bent and free, I glued the bigger side of the card to the back of the door. After painting the scored hinge black, I glued the other side of the card inside the garage building. Now painted, the next job was to weather the building up. I weathered the exterior with a wood coloured weathering wash, trying to make the effect uneven and to blend it in by removing some excess paint. I left the weathering on thicker around sills and roof edges and made it slightly heavier on the rail facing side of the building to simulate wood saturated by steam. The roof was weathered with Humbrol rust weathering powder, left slightly heavier on the rail facing side of the roof. Along the central roof line I added some green weathering powder to simulate the growth of moss and lichen. To give the impression of settled coal dust and ash from passing steam trains, I added a small layer of black Humbrol weathering powder on the rail facing side. With the weathering sealed on with varnish, all that was left was to fit a small piece of clear acrylic as window glazing. As I said earlier, this is only part one of working on this small section of the layout. We've got the basic static grass layer down, we've got the farmyard all painted up, we've got the buildings all decorated in place, but there's still a lot to do around that, which I'm going to be covering in a part 2 video coming out very soon. In this next part, I'd be covering things like scratch building fences, dry stone walling, adding additional layers of vegetation and shrubbery and things to the static grass that I've now put down, and really trying to bring this scene a little bit more to life rather than just having the basics. So thank you again for tuning in. Let me know in the comments below how you think it's looking so far. What techniques have you enjoyed seeing me use? Do you have any of your own techniques that you'd like to share? Perhaps some ways of doing things a little bit differently. And please make sure to check back in on the channel later once I put part 2 up and give that a watch. Thank you everyone, and I'll see you all very soon. Take care.